I'm Luke Powery, and I'm here with Charlie Lucas for the Duke Centennial Oral Histories program. This is such a great privilege for me to be with one of the Duke family members. And what I wanted to, I guess, begin this conversation with is, I know that Mary Duke Biddle Trent Semans is your grandmother. And she was the granddaughter of Benjamin Duke. Can you say a little bit about the family tree, the history of the family, and maybe even beginning with Washington Duke or going back further?
Sure. Let me just say it's a privilege to be able to sit here with my friend Luke Powery. So I'm happy to be here. So yes, it's an interesting story. It's a uniquely American story. Washington Duke was conscripted into the Confederate Army at age 45, so in 1865. He was then very quickly caught and was a prisoner of war. And then when the war ended, several months later, he was released in New Bern, North Carolina, and he walked home 130 miles to collect his children who had been kept by relatives and to came back to his farm, which was in disrepair. But he found some dried tobacco in one of his barns, and there's a famous photograph of him standing in front of this barn. And they took that tobacco and they processed it, chopped it up and processed it, put it in little muslin bags, sold it off the back of a mule-drawn wagon in and around Durham, and the rest, as they say, is history. The business, W. Duke Sons and Company, grew very quickly. By 1870, they had built a factory in the town of Durham, and his 14-year-old son, Buck, managed that factory. All three of the children from his second wife were involved in the business, Ben, Buck, and Mary. And then, and the business grew very, very quickly. By 1880, James B. Duke, Buck Duke, had moved to New York, and the Dukes were one of the largest smoking tobacco manufacturers in the country. But then they did something remarkable, and they made a very risky investment in 1884 in the Bonsack cigarette machine. And that was, it began the mass production of cigarettes. And by 1889, they were the largest cigarette manufacturer in the country. In 1890, James B. Duke and his brother basically force the other cigarette manufacturers in the United States to consolidate, and formed the American Tobacco Company. And the American Tobacco Company then controlled roughly 90% of the U.S. domestic tobacco market. From there, they diversify into other businesses. I'm cutting it short a little bit, but they diversify into other businesses. Ultimately, the tobacco company is, as a monopoly, is broken up by the U.S. government, and the Dukes really focus their capital and their energy on hydroelectric power. And Duke Power, Southern Power Company, is formed in 1905. It changes its name to Duke Power later. And all of that economic success allowed them to be philanthropic, beginning in the late 1880s or so. In 1890, Washington Duke facilitated the move of this small fledgling college, Methodist college, from Randolph County to Durham. He paid for the move, provided a small endowment, and then when Trinity College had moved, his son Ben took over essentially that role and became the college's at that point largest benefactor and long-serving trustee. And it was Ben Duke who really directed the family's philanthropic efforts that ultimately culminates in his brother forming the Duke Endowment in 1924. From there, it was really the Duke women, after Ben Duke died in 1929, it was really the Duke women that carried the flag forward. And ultimately that was my great grandmother, and then my grandmother, Mary Duke Biddle, Trent Semans, and then her children, and ultimately her grandchildren. And I'm just lucky to be one of those.
Wow. Well, we're lucky to know you.
So that's a long drawn out story, but actually cut a little short. But I think it gives you some context as to how we arrived where we are today.
No, most definitely. Thank you. Thinking about being a member of this influential family, obviously we're at the university, the endowment. I mean, how has that shaped your life? What has it meant to you to be a part of this, amazing family that has done so much good in the world?
I feel humbled and honored and blessed because I was born. I was lucky enough to be, the great great grandson of of Benjamin Duke, the great 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 grandson of Washington Duke. I mean, and then of course the grandson of my grandmother. I didn't have anything to do with that, but it certainly means an incredible amount, a great deal. The legacy of the family is unique. Duke University is, of course, unique in its incredible ascent over the last century, and the place of that it holds today in higher education internationally. It's remarkable how quickly that happened. But the family's philanthropic legacy across the two Carolinas and beyond, through other family foundations, is as I said, it's humbling, it's challenging because they're big shoes to fill. But we're all very, very blessed to be a part of it, and our ancestors set the bar very high, and so we have things to live up to, and we all try to do that.
Yeah. I know the family has still to this day continued deep ties with the university, which in many ways I think is unique and distinct. I mean, why do you think that connection is still there, so present?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned this because it was in a conversation I had with Dick Broadhead early on, and then Dick actually said this a couple of times publicly, but it's totally unique in American higher education that a founding family still has such close ties to the institution that it helped found. It's almost unheard of. And I think the reason is that there was such passion about this school from the very beginning that it carried over generation after generation after generation. And I don't know fully how to explain it other than to say that passion, when a member of your family is passionate about something, and especially when you're a child who can be influenced by those people, that passion tends to flow. And, Washington Duke was passionate about it enough to help it move to Durham and to provide financial stability. Ben Duke was totally passionate about it, and he and his father helped drive the college to coeducation early on in its history. He believed that this institution could be a force of good in the world. And then, of course, his daughter, Mary Duke Biddle, became a benefactor of the school. But ultimately, my grandmother, Mary Duke Biddle, Trent Semans, she was totally passionate about Duke University. And that passion flowed through to her children and her grandchildren. And still to this day, we take, we believe that we should help perpetuate the vision of the family at Duke University. It is unique though. It's unique, and we're grateful to the Duke administration for allowing us to continue to have that relationship. Because frankly, you know, in higher education, in the academy, many universities would probably say, we don't need the family.
Right.
Duke has been very different. Duke has embraced the family, and of course, my grandmother was a force of nature, and she made sure that the family was always present. But it's been, I think, a uniquely beneficial relationship for the university and certainly for the family. We take great pride in it.
For sure. I'm definitely going to ask you about your grandmother in a little while. And I wish I could have met her.
I wish you had known her.
She passed away the same year I arrived, but
I remember.
later. Yeah.
I remember.
But I want to ask you this. This is obviously the Centennial. And why is this year, I think, especially significant for the university, for the Duke Endowment, and for the Duke family? Like, what would you say?
Well, it only comes around once. It is. I think, you know, there's something in the human psyche that where you want to celebrate milestones, right? I think that this is a significant milestone for this university. And I mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. I don't think anyone would have envisioned 100 years ago where Duke would be today. And Duke today it's just a remarkable institution. I mean, it is a leader in every sense of the word in higher education across the globe. I mean, it's really amazing. It has taken a seat at the table with the great universities of the world. So I think it's an amazing milestone to celebrate for the university because it only took us 100 years. There are a lot of other schools that have hundreds of years of a head start, and we're pretty close. For the Duke Endowment, it's similar but a little different. I mean, the Duke Endowment, I think that Mr. Duke fully envisioned that the Duke Endowment would be here 100 years from now. I think he expects it to be perpetual and it'll be here another 100 years from now.
Right.
And I think he would be excited but not surprised at the influence that the endowment has had in the last 100 years. The influence over Duke University, of course, not over. The influence it has had on Duke University. But also, I think he would be pleased and excited about the work that the endowment has done over the Carolinas over the past 100 years. And I think the important thing about celebrating 100 years for the Duke Endowment is North and South Carolina would look very different today had it not been for the Duke Endowment's investment over the last 100 years. I mean, North and South Carolina are prosperous states today. They were very poor 100 years ago. And, the Duke Endowment helped build hospitals to create access to health care. It supported orphanages and families when there was very little support for that. It helped the church, of course, particularly small rural churches that could barely rub two nickels together. And then finally, the four schools that it supports. And each of those four schools, the Duke Endowment has forever been the largest benefactor at those four schools since its inception and remains so today. And those four schools would be different today, certainly, had it not been for the endowment. And then for the family, it's a special time to see these two institutions that have had such influence, certainly on the Carolinas, but beyond. To see these two institutions that have survived and thrived and really helped people over the last 100 years. It is a great legacy that we have inherited. Those of us that are living today, we've inherited this legacy, and we're blessed, and it is time to celebrate it, and to celebrate those that help do the work.
Yeah, no, it is a great time of celebration. One key figure, obviously, Mr. Duke, James B. Duke, thinking about the indenture of trust, and what that has done, what the document has done, and the impact of Mr. Duke's vision and generosity. Can you speak a little bit about this indenture, and for those that may not understand the significance?
Well, I encourage everybody to read it. Everyone should read it. It takes about 45 minutes. So it's a unique document. It's very lawyerly in some places. And then in the 7th division of the indenture, Mr. Duke really uses his own words to describe what he wanted the endowment to achieve. So let me first say that the trust indenture is actually the institutionalization of the family's philanthropy going back 30 years before the Duke Endowment was formed. So in the 1890s, Ben Duke, as I mentioned earlier, Ben Duke really led the family's philanthropy. And Ben Duke was the one that established the pattern of giving to education, hospitals and healthcare, orphanages and families, and the church. And we have, and there, I think there's some in the Duke archives. We certainly have it at the Duke Endowment. But there are these ledgers of Ben Duke's gifts in any one year. It's fascinating. He would give to dozens and dozens of colleges across the South and the country, dozens of hospitals, obviously dozens of churches. Really, really interesting to look at that. But it was Ben Duke that established the pattern. And then Ben Duke, who was his brother's closest advisor, they were very, very close. Ben Duke, over the course of roughly 20 plus years, helped shape his brother's vision for what his philanthropy should look like. So James B. Duke's first significant gift to Trinity College was in 1905 or so, and it was for the library. And it was Ben Duke that convinced his brother to do it. And then it was Ben Duke, and then ultimately William Preston Few, who was president of Trinity College beginning in 1910, William Perkins, Mr. Duke's lawyer, and then George Allen, his closest business advisor. Those four men really helped shape the basis of the trust indenture. So it took over a decade to sort of put this together. Mr. Perkins kept a copy of it in the top drawer of his desk for over a decade, and would pull it out whenever Mr. Duke wanted to tweak it or make adjustments. Finally, beginning in the early 20s, it was getting close, and Dr. Few in particular wanted to influence how Duke University might ultimately be the major beneficiary in the indenture. So they began actually buying some land in the early 20s before the indenture was signed. So that when the indenture was signed actually on December 11th, 1924, much of the land had already been assembled. And they knew, or at least the Dukes had assembled the land. The university didn't have it yet. And they knew that when the trust indenture said, that if Trinity College decides to change its name to Duke University, then they get a $6 million gift, and the Duke Endowment will build the campus and the like. And it took them 2 weeks. But the trust indenture it's an amazing document. It's a living document. It's very prescriptive in terms of what Mr. Duke wanted to do, but it's flexible enough to allow to allow for adjustments as times change. So, an example, Mr. Duke wanted to build hospitals because he believed that hospitals created access to care, particularly in rural communities. But hospitals were also economic drivers of their communities. They are today.
Right.
And he recognized that and knew that if he invested in hospitals, that it would help the economic well-being of the community as well. But ultimately, we had built all the hospitals that we needed to build. And so by the time we get to the late 1990s, the emphasis of the endowment changed, and it started to focus more on healthcare in a holistic way. And so today, we really don't provide much capital, we don't make many capital investments in hospitals or healthcare facilities, but we do fund healthcare programs across the two Carolinas, primarily to improve the health of all Carolinians. And it's a subtle shift,
Right.
but it still adheres to Mr. Duke's original vision of investing in healthcare to improve the health of the people of the Carolinas. That's just an example.
Yeah.
But the document is it is what we live by. We're very careful to adhere to Mr. Duke's wishes because legally we're bound to. At the same time, he gave his trustees uncontrolled discretion to do what they need to do in order to fulfill his wishes. So it's a very interesting document. You know, just as an additional note, we're required as a board to read the indenture aloud to each other once a year. We're required to do it. It's in the document, so legally we're bound to do it. So this past December, we read the indenture to the assembled Duke Endowment trustees, and we also included the Duke University trustees. And it was a really magical moment because most of the Duke University trustees had never read the indenture, certainly had never heard it read. Right. And it was magical. It was a binding moment between our two boards that we haven't had in a very long time. And it was really special.
Wow. Tell me about that image. I wish I was in the room.
It was very special.
But to have both trustees together reading that document, can you say something about the relationship between the Duke Endowment and Duke University and how the Duke Endowment helps the university fulfill its mission and the vision of Mr. Duke?
So it's a unique relationship. So if you go back to the beginning, Mr. Duke had a vision that the Duke Endowment would sit here, and the trustees of the Duke Endowment would be directors of the power company, because the Duke Endowment was the largest shareholder of the power company. And the Duke Endowment trustees would also be trustees of the university, because the Duke Endowment was the largest funder of the university. So his vision was the Duke Endowment would sit here and everything else would be under that. Okay. Well, the IRS didn't like that very much. The government didn't like it. So that vision sort of it was adjusted pretty quickly after Mr. Duke's death. I'd say, late 30s. Okay. That was not happening. But trustees of the Duke Endowment remained directors of the power company for a very long time, and trustees of the endowment also remained trustees of the university for a very long time. In fact, my grandmother, I think, was the last Duke Endowment trustee to also be a trustee of the university. Which I think was totally appropriate, by the way. But
sure.
So in the early days, of course, the Duke Endowment's gift built East and West Campus from scratch. And East Campus, of course, the Georgian East Campus that we know today was built at the same time that the Gothic West Campus was built. Most of the buildings on East Campus at the time were either torn down or weren't kept. West and East Duke, and I think a couple of others along Buchanan maybe, are original. Anyway, so the two campuses are built, and the endowment also provides operational support to Duke University. And in the 1930s in particular, and in the 1960s, the Duke Endowment's financial support actually exceeded tuition revenue. I mean, the Duke Endowment was critical to the financial stability and survival of Duke University on numerous occasions. Duke University ultimately transforms, however, we know, and happily, and 1970s, 1980s, and of course we are where we are today, and so today the role of the endowment is really quite different. Today the endowment is able to support initiatives at the university that are important to the president and the provost, and are things maybe that would be on a wish list that they might not otherwise be able to fund or might not otherwise be able to do at the moment. Some of the things, I'm just thinking, some of the things, just as an example, recent grants, like very recent grants. The new gateway for the Duke Gardens, which is about to be constructed, which is going to be magnificent, by the way. But it took a long time to come together, and it was the Duke Endowment's initial gift and their final gift that enabled them to be able to pull the money together to make that happen. The renovation of Lilly Library is another example where pre-COVID, I think everything was on track. COVID stops everything, creates a funding shortfall. The Duke Endowment is able to come back in with a second gift. And then the Lilly family came in with a gift. And now Lilly is going to happen when it could have been delayed by 5 to 7 years, which, by the way, would have been terrible because Lilly needs to be Lilly needs a renovation. So today it's a little different. And we're able to devote more resources to help the university become even better. So some of the things that we can do today to make the university even greater are investments in faculty support and in financial aid. Where Duke struggles to match some of its peers, older peers, is on the endowment side, obviously. And so financial, endowment for scholarships and financial aid, endowment for endowed professorships, where they can effectively recruit faculty in the market against their, as I said, older peers. Our support has been able to supplement what the university can do there and make it more competitive in a highly competitive marketplace against their Ivy League peers and their non-Ivy peers.
Most definitely. Now, as the current chair of the endowment, and just thinking about the endowment and moving in, because it's the endowment centennial as well, looking to the second century, I mean, what would you say are some particular goals that you have or that the endowment has in the next century?
So when I look at the Duke Endowment, one of the most important things to me is that we continue to adhere closely to Mr. Duke's vision. We take donor intent very seriously. And I think where some of our peer foundations have perhaps gone astray over the years is when they have lost track of what their donor may have intended. In our case, it's easy to honor donor intent because we have a legal document that forces our hand. And all that was by design, and we take donor intent. So I would want us to continue to follow Mr. Duke's wishes really closely. That said, I know, my fellow trustees know that in healthcare in particular, our investments on an annual basis, call them right this minute, call them $50 million. It is a drop in the bucket in terms of the total healthcare spend in North and South Carolina. So how can we better utilize those resources to have as large an impact as possible on healthcare in the Carolinas? So we're following a strategy in which we are trying to be an accelerating partner, is what we're calling ourselves, where we want to direct our resources to innovation in healthcare, to improve healthcare processes, to improve the delivery of healthcare, to improve access to the extent we can, but an accelerating partner where you take innovation and you can scale it quickly to improve the delivery of healthcare services. That's just an example. So I want us to be true to Mr. Duke's and his brother's vision, frankly, of the Duke family's philanthropy. I want us to continue to support our schools in a way to make all 4 of our schools better: Duke, Davidson, Furman, and Johnson C. Smith. I want us to be innovators in healthcare and try to maximize the effectiveness of our resources. And the same thing goes in our child and family well-being division area as well. You know, the big player in that area is the government, of course. We have to figure out how to be a partner with the government in order to maximize the use of our resources. It sounds tactical, but it's actually strategic in ultimately how we make our resources go further and have the greatest impact across the 2 Carolinas. That's what Mr. Duke would have wanted.
Wow, okay. Now, in terms of Mr. Duke and where the university is today, what do you, from your perspective, of course, he's not here, but what would he think about the university today if he saw what Duke is?
Yeah. So James B. Duke and his brother Ben, but James B. Duke was a builder. He was a builder. He loved building things, creating things. In fact, one of his biographies was called Master Builder. But so he loved the idea of building this great university. He saw the original plans for West Campus before he died. I mean, he knew, he selected the architect. He knew what was going to happen before he died unexpectedly, 10 months after he signed the trust indenture in October of 1925. So, I mentioned this when we announced our Centennial gift to Duke University last December. I think he would be pleased, and I think he would be excited about where Duke University is today. He might even be amazed at the incredible growth and progress that it has made in the world of higher education. But I don't think he would be surprised, right? Because he generally got his way. And he was a visionary. And so he was a huge global thinker. When you think about the businesses that he built, the American Tobacco Company, the British American Tobacco Company, these were global enterprises. Right. He invested in the early hydroelectric power, large hydroelectric power projects in Canada. He was one of the earliest investors and a major investor in Alcoa and in Amerada Hess, large, big, global industrial enterprises. so he thought in really big terms. So I don't think he'd be surprised at the scope of the university today, but I think he would be, and I don't think he would want us to rest on our laurels. What he would want is for us to keep going. Like he wanted to dominate his businesses. I think he would want Duke University to do the same. In the indenture, in the 7th division of the indenture, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, I want Duke University to take a real place of leadership in the educational world. Duke has done that. And I think has succeeded beyond the expectations of Mr. Duke's associates and even the family. But he would want us to keep going. He would want us to never stop. And I think, the oft quoted phrase that Terry Sanford used, outrageous ambitions. He had outrageous ambitions for this institution. And I think he would want us to continue with that type of attitude. Let's go.
Right.
Let's be great.
Right.
Let's be the greatest that we can be.
Yeah.
That's what he would want.
Yeah. Thinking of that let's go attitude, I have to turn to your grandmother, Mary Duke Biddle Trent Semans, who is just, I never met her, but is a luminary and a heavy presence in my mind. And various people around Duke still talk about her and her influence and who she was as a person. And obviously James V. Duke, Benjamin Duke, Washington Duke, the family members, and including her, and to this day, that legacy of giving, that generous spirit and heart is so present. How do you, thinking about your grandmother, I mean, if you could speak a little bit about her, who she was and what she embodied, but how do you continue her legacy and that of your other ancestors?
Well, she was a force of nature. I wish you had known her. She was a force of nature. My grandmother was a force of good in the world, and she really always wanted to do the right thing. And she would go to extra lengths to ensure that she did, or that her children or that her grandchildren did the right thing. She was passionate. She was energetic. She was a little like the Energizer Bunny. I mean, she never stopped. She would, she used her time wisely. She would write letters, and she wrote her own speeches out in longhand. So she would write while she was in the car. She would write at the breakfast room table. She was always busy. But when she spoke to you, there was nobody else that she was speaking to. She was able to focus on the person or the group that she was speaking to, and it was as if it was only the two of you. And that's a gift that she had, but it went to her soul because she believed that she needed to connect with whoever she was with. Living into her legacy is something that we all struggle with, frankly, every day, because she was this larger than life persona. And so I don't pretend to be able to do that. She was chairman of the Duke Endowment for 19 years. And the Duke Endowment grew significantly over the course of her chairmanship. It evolved over the course of her chairmanship. She was the first woman chairman. She just, she was a remarkable leader, but she did it with grace. And, you know, I feel like when I say grace, you would know what I'm talking about. It's truly God's grace.
Yeah.
She lived her life with grace, and I don't think I've lived with grace, but I sure try.
Right.
And that's what we all of her children and grandchildren, and I think other people in the family aspire to try and do that with her. Her influence on Duke University was enormous. And, you know, I often tell Vince Price this. He's the first president of Duke University that did not know my grandmother. Wow. Going back to William Preston Few.
Wow.
Right, I know. I mean, my grandmother matriculated at Duke when she was 16 in 1936. And so Dr. Few was the president at the time. So truly, every president of Duke University had known my grandmother until Vince, until she died in 1912 and in 2012, and that's saying something. And her influence on each of those presidents was significant because it was that family connection that Dick Broadhead spoke about that was driven largely by Mary Semans, and. You know, her interests went far beyond Duke. She was a patron of the arts. She and her husband, you know, helped found the UNC School of the Arts. They were patrons of of both the performing arts and the visual arts, and she made many anonymous gifts. In and around Durham. She was a true citizen of the world, but she was really a citizen of Durham. And she loved Durham. She loved New York too, which is where she grew up, but she loved Durham and took great pride in Durham's evolution post-tobacco. She took great pride in the improving relationship between the university and Durham, which had initiated when she was still chair of the Duke Endowment, the Duke Durham Neighborhood Partnership, which today is part of the university's mission, frankly. So she loved Durham, she loved the university, and she loved bringing the two together, and she was inseparable from all of it, frankly. And as I said, that's a tough legacy, frankly, to live into and to live up to. But she was a woman of love, and we loved her. She loved her family. She taught us all a lot. She taught us to be passionate about Duke University, about the Duke Endowment, about the mission, about the family's philanthropic legacy, about the arts, about people. You know, she was active in the civil rights movement through the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s. As I said, she was the first woman to serve as chair of the Duke Endowment. She was the first woman mayor pro tem of Durham in the 1950s when she was only in her early 30s. I mean, she had 4 little girls. Before she had her other 3 children, and so she was a force. Wow. She was a big personality. But we were blessed to have her.
She was small.
She was teeny tiny.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, she was teeny tiny. Yeah. But we were all blessed to have her in our lives as long as we did.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Talking about the passion, just wondering, for you, what makes you most proud of Duke? I know you're an alum of the other school as well, the Tar Heels, but also Duke. Well, but what makes you most proud of?
Funny story about that. So, I had been accepted to come to Duke and I was all in, and I was a nominee for the Moorhead Kane Scholarship at Chapel Hill, and I end up getting the scholarship. So I call my grandmother, and I'm like, okay, well, I've received it, but I have to let the Moorhead committee know before I even get to interview for the AB Duke, because my AB Duke interview was 2 weeks later. And she said, doesn't matter. You have to accept the Moorhead. And I'm there on the telephone with her, and I'm like, really? And she's like, you can always come back to Duke, but this will give you a perspective of North Carolina that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were at Duke. And she loved the University of North Carolina. So anyway, that's how I ended up at Chapel Hill. She basically told me I needed to go. And so I was able to come back and redeem myself a bit, in my family's eyes at least, and go to the law school. So why am I so passionate about Duke University? You know, it flowed from her, for sure. But this institution it's achieved so much. And I'm so proud of it. I know others are proud of it. I'm so proud of it. But it can do so much more. It can be so much more. And I believe, with the support of the Duke Endowment, with the loyal support of a remarkable alumni base, and with strong strategic leadership from both the board and the administration, Duke University, the sky is the limit for this school. And that's what makes me so excited. Right. It's going to be, I mean, think about how great it is today. It's going to be even greater. And I think it has the potential to be everything Mr. Duke wanted it to be. Everything Ben Duke and Washington Duke ever envisioned for this school. It can be that. But you know, I think, and you and I have talked about this before, I think one of the things that sets Duke apart from its peers is the fact that the chapel is in the middle of the campus, and it is a part of Duke's daily life. If you go to some of its peer institutions, I'll name a few, right. Princeton, Yale, Chicago, that have great churches that are not central to what happens on campus every day. But the chapel that James B. Duke envisioned, that I think his father would be very proud of, by the way, but as a devout Methodist, but that chapel is central to everything that happens at Duke almost every day, because it's just right there. And no one walking along Abel Quad can miss it. And the Divinity School is where it is because it's the conscience of the university. And it's it is a critical part of what Mr. Duke envisioned for Duke University. And when you read about the schools that he wanted to be part of the university, you know, Duke has achieved all of those goals, and the Divinity School is an important part of it.
Most definitely.
But without the chapel, we would be a different institution, and I think a lesser institution.
That's right. I'm in full agreement. I wonder why.
That's exactly right, Dean of the Chapel.
I wonder why. Let's close with this question. Thinking about the university and the next century, what are some of your hopes for Duke?
Well, as I said earlier, I think I would want the same thing that James B. Duke and Ben Duke would want. I want Duke to keep pushing forward. I would hope that Duke would never become timid or rest on its laurels as being a great university. I think we have to continue to work hard to recruit the best faculty. I would love us to have more Nobel laureates. Let's think big. I want us to have the best students, but students of character. One of the things that Mr. Duke says in the indenture is he wanted his students and the faculty and the administration to be persons of the highest character. I think it makes a difference. I want Duke to continue to achieve greatness in academics and research. I also want Duke to achieve on the athletic field. I mean, I'll confess.
No surprise.
I'm a fan. And so, but, you know, if you boil all that down to one thing, I want Duke to be the best it can possibly be. Now that sounds like, it sounds too squishy. Mm-hmm. But Duke is going to have significant resources from the Duke Endowment, from alumni, from its own endowment and resources. Duke's going to have plenty of resources. Let's use them wisely, and let's be the truly great institution that we can be. Let's not squander those resources or squander the moment when we know that we're on the cusp of, I think, even more greatness as an institution. I believe it. You know, the higher education, I think, is, you know, it's entering a phase where it's going to struggle, particularly smaller private schools. Duke is not in that world anymore. Used to be, not anymore. Duke is an elite institution in every sense of the word, both when you look at its faculty, when you look at its students, when you look at the achievement of all of its constituencies. But Duke is also elite in terms of resources, and it can use those resources to become even greater and surpass even what we see today. It has a chance to be even more special. By the way, I think Duke is special because it's a happy place. So when you think about Duke, in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, and it started to change then, but Duke was often the second, maybe even the third choice of some of the kids, some of the students that ultimately came to Duke, where they might have wanted to go to Princeton or Harvard or Yale or Stanford or Northwestern or whatever the school. It's quite different today, and it makes a palpable difference on the campus. The kids that are at Duke today want to be here, and they're happy to be here. This is where they want to be, and the fact that they want to be here, it makes a huge difference. And I think building on that happiness makes it gives the university a sense of joy that will enable us to launch into our second century. I think it's pretty remarkable.
It is. But thanks so much, Charlie, for that kind of historical perspective on the endowment, the university, the family, and thank you for your passion. Right?
It's truly my pleasure.
And for highlighting the sense of joy that I think Duke gives all of us.
It gives all of us joy.
Yeah, it really does.
Thanks you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.